Yes, I am against wokeism. I do believe that wokeism takes a view of humanity that is diametrically opposed to the view of humanity in the scriptures. Even Hannibal Lecter, and I know that Hannibal Lecter, the writer had to make him even more obviously evil because people were misunderstanding and thinking he was an anti-hero, and the guy was like, no, this guy's not a hero. But even he looks attractive, and I once made a video saying that he would eat wokists for lunch because that prison scene where Agent Starling says, hey, maybe we can figure out what's wrong with you if you help me here, and he goes, there's nothing wrong with me. I am who I choose to be. You can't reduce me to a set of first causes. And that's what wokeists want to do. They want to reduce everybody to a set of first causes. And that's not what the Bible says we are, and that's not what even Hannibal Lecter knows better than to be reduced to a set of first causes. But then they're not responsible for their choices, see? They can hate, and it's not their fault because they're this set of things and you're that set of things. So they're supposed to hate you. And no, you can't ever understand them because you're that set of things over there. So no one is accountable to one truth. So is wokeism bad? Yeah, wokeism is from the pit of hell. Run from it as fast as you can. So what I'm going to talk about here is a conference, supposedly a pastor's conference, where they talked about fighting wokeism. And I think wokeism should be fought for the very reasons I say, though. Not because the accusations that woke people make people in some groups uncomfortable. Evangelical Christians are uncomfortable with the specific accusations that wokeists make. And they're probably right to be uncomfortable, but that isn't the reason you should oppose it. You should oppose it because it has a view of man that is diametrically opposed to what the Bible teaches. But if evangelical pastors are not teaching doctrine, then that doesn't really register as a reason, does it? All they can go with is, that makes my congregation feel uncomfortable. Those charges are hurtful. So let's fight wokeism. Let's ban wokeism. Let's get the politicians to ban it for us. Because they're being ugly and they're saying ugly things about us and they're acting stupid. They are doing all that. But that's not the reason why you should oppose it. You should oppose it again because it's a lie. It teaches an opposite view of humanity that the Bible teaches, and teaches an opposite view of how we need to and should treat our neighbor than the Bible teaches. The interesting thing about this conference, and I'm reading from a blog, a fellow Reverend Christopher Thoma, and he went to that conference as a confessional church pastor. Almost everyone else there was evangelical pastors. And I know on this channel, I've said things unflattering about the evangelical church. And I was an evangelical. I grew up an evangelical. I was an evangelical as an adult. I've switched to a confessional church because I think the confessional church is perfect. No, I'm not looking to join a perfect church. If I could find a perfect church I could join, it would quit being a perfect church the moment I joined it. I'd be the problem. But we can do much, much better than we have been, being a faithful bride of Christ. And the truth is, if you could take the best of both formats, confessional, what goes on in confessional churches, where they're doing the things that Christian churches have done for the last 2,000 years. They're continuing those things that the church has done. That's great. Evangelical churches, they have strengths and weaknesses too. But if you could take the best of both of them, leave out the weaknesses, you'd have a much better church. And that's what I support. The strong point of the confessional churches is that they are resistant to change. They hold fast to what they received 2,000 years ago. And they are not shaken by whatever the current thing is. by whatever the wind of doctrine is now. So they are good at preserving things at a time when the world's going crazy. And that's the world we're living in right now. So they have a big advantage there. Now, they have some disadvantages. If you're looking to, let's say they're 90-something% right, but there are 2 or 3 areas where what they've inherited, their doctrinal belief is a little off, their practice is a little off, they don't change. They don't change. So if you're talking about maximizing potential, that might not be the best thing to do. But guess what? I'm not, again, maximizing potential is like looking for the perfect church. If there's a perfect church, I would ruin it if I became a member of a perfect church. So the evangelical churches, though, they've gotten away from doctrine. They have this thing called, this saying, this bromide, this cliche, deeds, not creeds. Deeds, not creeds. And then the other catchphrase is when they appeal to the confessional pastors to throw away the church tradition and start doing things more like they do it, they're like, you just have to be courageous. You just have to be brave. And that's what they say. Now, I think it's the truth, and this culture is the opposite. I think you have to be brave to hold on to the traditions that were learned from the apostles, that are taught in the scriptures, in a world that is just not using reason, but it's using volume and demands, that you give those things up and agree to whatever the current thing is. Okay? So I think it is questionable. Yes, it does take courage. If you are in a confessional church and you do one of those few things your organization does wrong, if it becomes an issue, it does take courage to say, hey, I know that I'm paid to toe the party line here, but I think we need to change this. That does take courage. But as far as standing fast against a culture that is going mad because they've turned their backs on God, and when you turn your back on God, you don't just turn your back on God. You turn your back on truth. You turn your back on reason. You turn your truth back on love. You turn your back on light and life. There's substandard substitutes for all these things the enemy tries to throw in there, but you turn your back on all those things. So I would say one of the cliches that evangelical pastors are putting onto confessional pastors, you just got to be brave, you just got to show courage. It's not true. You don't need to throw away the teachings and the doctrines your church has handed down for 2,000 years. That's not an act of bravery to do that. Not when the culture around you is banging on the door, demanding you throw it out. The courageous thing to do is to stay with it. And I think some of it may be the evangelical churches. That's one weakness they have. The evangelical churches, they are willing to change. Too willing to change for the wrong reason. Not because they've become convinced some other thing is true as far as the doctrine goes, but it's about market share. It's about, I'm opposed to wokeism because my congregation is uncomfortable with it now. Well, in 50 years, they may not be. They may be comfortable with it, in which case, guess what? They then embrace it because there's no doctrinal reason not to. That idea of who man is and how we should view our neighbor, that's not taught. Honestly, I don't want to overgeneralize because it's not true in every case, but I believe there is a segment of these teachers that keep going, deeds, not creeds. They just don't want accountability. That's all. Creeds makes even the leadership accountable. You can't preach next year the opposite of what you preached last year and expect it to fly when you've got creeds. But if you say, if we make every Sunday the sermon about, let's twist it into a metaphor about our life and how we're to live our life, and instead of having its own standalone meaning and talking about God, you can do that. You can say make one point one year and make the opposite point the next year, and they just go with the emotional flow and not an unchanging standard of intellectual truth. So yeah, it's a lot less accountability for the leadership of an evangelical church. So anyway, they had this conference about Turning Point USA, Charlie Kirk. They had this conference, pastors' conference, about fighting wokeism. A lot of the speakers were not pastors, though. One of them, James Lindsay, was an atheist, but he was there because he is one of the big guys at fighting wokeism and saying wokeism is crazy. He's attacking it from secular perspective. So they make treaty with him. And so Reverend Thoma shows up. He shows up in his collar. He was the only guy there with a collar. And the evangelical pastors that were up there on the stage, you know, they would take their shots. They would demand people, you just need to be courageous. You just need to be brave, and throw all that stuff out and get on board backing our efforts to fight the current thing. As if, like the traditional churches, the confessional churches, they're doing the Eucharist, they're doing confession, absolution, they're doing the liturgy, they're preaching the gospel and Jesus and baptizing people. They're doing all that regardless of what this outside world's saying. They're not. They may think, well, you're not being outspoken enough against wokeism because you're spending so much time doing all this stuff the church has done for the last 2,000 years. This is an emergency. Throw all that out and start preaching against wokeism in your sermons. That's the idea that the evangelical pastors are. But the atheist speaker had some very interesting things to say, and Reverend Thoma noted them in his blog. He got up there and he quoted the godfather, a Brazilian named Freire or something like that, one of the godfathers of wokeism, or critical theory is what the formal name of it. And he got up there and said, according to this guy, according to this godfather of critical theory, we are not afraid of these new churches that emphasize emotion and don't have a rigorous set of doctrines. Our enemy is the traditional churches that have the set of doctrines and stick with them and don't change. The other guys have already shown if you can change the culture, you can change what they say and what they believe. So we're not worried about them. We're worried about the ones who have not changed. They keep doing what they're doing, even when the culture is telling them they need to do something else. You see where this is getting at? Right now, the evangelical pastors have congregations who are uncomfortable with the accusations and the claims of wokeism. So they're against it. So they want you to be against it. They want laws to be passed against it. But what about the children and grandchildren? When they grow up, if they get indoctrinated, suddenly they're okay with wokeism. Well, if that's what your market wants now, if you want your congregation, which is what it's all about, if you're not teaching truth, then how do you measure success? Well, it's got to be in numbers. So to reach the numbers, you proclaim how wonderful wokeism is, and your new idea of righteousness is doing what the woke suggest. So there's no natural barrier to wokeism just taking over. The father of critical theory says, don't worry about those newfangled churches. Once we change the culture, they will follow along. Worry about the ones that won't, because they are guided by their tradition. They are guided by truth. Those guys are going to be the ones we need to attack. And so Reverend Thoma patiently waited for a chance to get a question. They barely gave him one. But he said, well, okay, what can these other churches that are not traditional do to become more like those of us who are already optimal for resisting wokeism? And to his surprise, and to James Lindsay's, the atheist, surprise, an evangelical pastor grabbed the microphone from him and said, you just got to be brave. You just got to have courage. Same cliche, same bromide. Guys, the real courage is found in keeping your calm, to some extent tuning out these crazy accusations from the woke, and calmly and with love continue to preach the gospel and continue to do what you got to do. Can we oppose them by saying, look, here's what the Bible teaches humanity is? Yes, that's the best way to do it. What's the worst way to do it? The way the evangelicals are wanting to do it. Let's get a big enough coalition, include a bunch of atheists, and pass laws banning it. You don't need to pass laws banning it if you've shown everybody it's a terrible idea. So do the intellectual work, do the doctrinal work, and show everybody it's a terrible idea. Thank you so much for listening, and may God bless you.